Chandler Halderson. On July 1, 2021, in Windsor, Wisconsin, Chandler Halderson fired a rifle into his father's back in the basement of their family home. Bart Halderson was 50 years old, a man who had worked hard to provide for his family. When Krista Halderson, 53, returned home later that day, Chandler ended her life as well. What followed over the next several days would reveal a young man whose entire adult life had been built on fabrications that he would do anything to protect. Chandler had constructed an elaborate false reality for his parents. He claimed to be enrolled at Madison College when he had actually failed out. He told his family he had secured a prestigious position at SpaceX, even creating fake emails from school officials to maintain the deception. For months, Bart and Krista believed their son was building a successful future. The lies began to crumble in the days before the incident. Bart had confronted Chandler about inconsistencies in his college transcripts. The parents were asking questions that Chandler could not answer without exposing years of deception. Prosecutors argued that he feared being cut off from family support and losing everything he had pretended to achieve. After ending his parents' lives, Chandler dismembered their remains. He scattered the body parts across multiple locations in southern Wisconsin. Investigators would later discover Bart's torso on a farm property, placed inside an oil drum. Krista's legs were found in the Wisconsin River. The tools used for dismemberment included a saw, scissors, and bolt cutters. On July 7th, Chandler reported his parents missing to police. He told investigators they had left for a trip to the family cabin in LLED County and never returned. He mentioned uncharacteristic gambling behavior to explain their absence. But the story contained inconsistencies that raised immediate red flags. The investigation breakthrough came through Snapchat location data. The app's Snap Map feature placed Chandler at the exact locations where his parents' remains would later be discovered. His girlfriend, Catherine Mellender, provided additional cell phone data to investigators and was cleared of any involvement in the crimes. The trial took place in January 2022. Prosecutors presented the digital evidence alongside the forensic findings from the scattered remains. The defense argued that while Chandler was clearly a liar, that did not make him responsible for the deaths. They portrayed him as someone who fabricated stories, but was not capable of the acts he was accused of committing. The jury disagreed after reviewing all the evidence. Chandler was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, along with charges of mutilation of a corpse and providing false information. In March 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, Chandler made a statement: "I would trade my life for any of theirs." Whether this represented genuine remorse or another performance remained a question for those who watched him throughout the proceedings. Krista's cousin, Barbie Townsend, spoke about the family's devastation, noting that Bart and Krista would have done anything to help their son through his difficulties. She stated, "They would have given everything to help him. Instead, their willingness to support their son cost them their lives." In 2023, 2 of Chandler's convictions related to hiding corpses were vacated on procedural grounds, but his life sentence remained intact. In November 2025, a Wisconsin appeals court affirmed his conviction. He remains in prison with no possibility of release. The case was featured on ABC's 2020 in May 2025, bringing renewed attention to the deception that had defined Chandler's relationship with his parents. Bart and Krista Halderson had worked hard to provide their sons with opportunities, never imagining that one of them would repay their generosity with betrayal. Mitchell Halderson, Chandler's older brother, lost both parents and effectively lost his brother as well. The family that had gathered for holidays and celebrated achievements together was destroyed by one member's unwillingness to face the truth about his failures. The next case would involve a confrontation that lasted only minutes, but ended 2 lives. Daniel Dighton. On September 30th, 2009, in South Croydon, London, 35-year-old Daniel Dighton attacked his parents in their family home. His father, Barry, was 61, a former headmaster who had dedicated his career to education. His mother, Elizabeth, was 60, a teacher who shared her husband's commitment to shaping young minds. Both were preparing for a holiday in France when an argument with their son turned fatal. Daniel was unemployed and living with his parents at the time. He had been described as a layabout who contributed nothing to the household while depending entirely on his parents for support. He had developed a pattern of lying about his circumstances and avoiding any meaningful work or responsibility. The morning of September 30th, Daniel was hungover from the previous night. His parents confronted him about his laziness and lack of direction in life. They had supported him for years while he contributed nothing to the household, and their patience had worn thin. The argument escalated from criticism to rage in a matter of minutes. What Barry and Elizabeth intended as parental concern triggered something in their son that they never anticipated. Daniel retrieved a knife and attacked his father first. Barry sustained 4 stab wounds. Elizabeth suffered far worse, 28 stab wounds in total. The attack was frenzied and prolonged, the wounds indicating repeated strikes driven by uncontrolled fury. Neighbors heard screams coming from the Dighton home and called emergency services. When police arrived, Daniel had hidden in the loft of the house. He was discovered and arrested immediately, still in the home where his parents lay dead. During the attack, Elizabeth reportedly spoke to her son. "What are you doing, Danny? I love you." These were among the last words she ever spoke, directed at the son who was taking her life. The statement was later presented during trial proceedings. The trial examined Daniel's mental state at the time of the incident. Psychiatric evaluations identified schizoid personality traits and acute stress that had contributed to his explosive reaction. The prosecution sought murder convictions, but the jury accepted the defense argument for diminished responsibility. Daniel was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder and sentenced to indefinite imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. The sentence was later reduced on appeal. Despite ending the lives of both his parents, Daniel stood to benefit from their deaths. As their only surviving child, Daniel inherited approximately £1.5 million from his parents' estate. The law in England and Wales does not automatically prevent someone convicted of manslaughter from inheriting from their victims, particularly when diminished responsibility is established. Daniel Dighton was released from custody in 2024. He served his minimum term and was deemed fit for release. He is now free to access the inheritance that came from the parents he took from this world. Barry and Elizabeth Dighton had dedicated their careers to education, spending decades shaping the lives of young people. They had hoped their own son would find his way, perhaps with enough patience and support. Instead, their final moments were spent trying to understand why their son had turned on them. The case highlighted the legal complexities surrounding inheritance and criminal responsibility. While murder convictions typically bar inheritance under the forfeiture rule, manslaughter findings with diminished responsibility create gray areas that allow Daniel to benefit financially from his parents' estate. What happens when a family argument ends with a call from a church? Trevor Lee. On August 4th, 2025, in Middleburg, Florida, Trevor Lee shot his parents David Lee and Brandy Smith in their family home. David was 44 years old. Brandy was 45. Both were military veterans who had built what neighbors described as a loving household. The events leading up to that morning remain partially unclear. Reports indicate that a family argument preceded the incident, though the specific nature of the dispute has not been publicly disclosed. Trevor had no prior criminal history, and those who knew the family expressed shock at what transpired. Trevor's best friend, who had known him since elementary school, described him as a great friend and a good person. The friend said David and Brandy had treated him like a son during the years of their friendship. The statement emphasized that Trevor's actions represented a terrible decision, rather than a reflection of who he had always been. After the shooting, Trevor walked to Cross Point Church nearby. From there, he placed a 22-minute call to 911. His demeanor on the call was described as calm. He confessed to what he had done and made a specific request. "I need to pray." These were the words Trevor spoke during his call to emergency services. He waited at the church for police to arrive, surrendering without incident when they did. Forensic examination of the scene confirmed multiple gunshot wounds to both victims. The investigation focused on reconstructing the timeline of events and determining what had led to the fatal confrontation. Records revealed that there had been prior service calls to the home, including a domestic disturbance in 2022. Trevor was indicted as an adult on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The decision to charge him as an adult reflected the severity of the charges and Florida law regarding serious offenses. He appeared before a judge on August 19th and entered a plea of not guilty. The case is scheduled for trial in February 2026. Until then, Trevor remains in custody, awaiting the proceedings that will determine his fate. The community that knew the Lee family continues to process the loss of 2 people who, by all accounts, were devoted parents. David and Brandy Lee had served their country in the military before settling into civilian life in Middleburg. They raised their son in what neighbors described as a stable, loving environment. The disconnect between the family others observed and the events of August 4th remains difficult for those who knew them to reconcile. The case raises difficult questions about what can lead someone with no apparent warning signs to commit such an act. As the legal process unfolds, investigators continue working to understand the full picture of what happened inside the Lee home that morning. The next case involved a party that no one who attended would ever forget. Tyler Hadley. On July 16, 2011, in Port St. Lucie, Florida, Tyler Hadley used a hammer to end the lives of his parents Blake and Mary Jo in their family home. Blake was 54 years old, a man who had tried to help his son address his problems. Mary Jo was 47. After concealing what he had done, Tyler invited approximately 60 people over for a party that would become one of the most disturbing house parties in American criminal history. Tyler had grown increasingly resentful of his parents' discipline and their plans to address his substance use. He had been using ecstasy and other substances, developing what he later described as a detachment from reality. Dark humor about harming his parents had evolved from jokes into something more serious. In a 2024 interview, Tyler explained that the idea began as a passing thought that he could not shake. He described entering what he called a psychotic trance and wanting to stop the pain he was experiencing. What started as dark fantasy became deadly action. The attack occurred in the afternoon. Tyler struck both parents with a hammer, leaving them in the master bedroom. He then concealed the bedroom and began inviting friends over through social media. Within hours, dozens of teenagers filled the Hadley home, unaware of what lay behind the closed bedroom door. During the party, Tyler told a friend what he had done. He reportedly bragged about the act, telling the friend that hosting a party after what he did had never been done before. The friend initially struggled to believe what he was hearing, but eventually looked behind the bedroom door. The friend contacted police, who arrived to discover the bodies of Blake and Mary Jo. Tyler was arrested at the scene, still at his own party, surrounded by guests who had no idea they had been celebrating feet away from a crime scene. Forensic examination revealed the hammer used in the attack, still bearing traces of the assault. The lack of defensive wounds suggested the victims had been caught by surprise. The scene inside the bedroom stood in stark contrast to the party atmosphere that had filled the rest of the house. The case proceeded through the legal system over the following years. Tyler entered a no-contest plea to 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole in 2014. However, changes to Florida law regarding juvenile sentencing led to a resentencing hearing. Tyler was resentenced in 2018 and will be eligible for a sentence review in 2039. He remains incarcerated in Florida, having spent his entire adult life behind bars for what he did when he was 17. In his 2024 interview, Tyler spoke about the maniacal rage he experienced that day and the regret he carries. He described the disconnect between the person he was in that moment and the person he believes he has become during his years of incarceration. Whether that transformation is genuine remains for parole boards to assess. The partygoers who attended that night have carried their own burdens. Many did not learn until later what had been concealed in the next room while they socialized and celebrated. The psychological impact of that discovery has followed some of them for years. The next case would involve claims of demonic influence and end with an execution. Sean Sellers. On March 5, 1986, in Oklahoma City, Sean Sellers shot his mother Vonda and stepfather Paul Bellofato while they slept in their home. Vonda was 32 years old. Paul was 43. Sean then staged the scene to look like an outside intruder had broken in and committed the act. But this was not Sean's first time taking a life. 6 months earlier, in September 1985, he had shot and killed a convenience store clerk named Robert Bauer. When later asked why, Sean offered an unsettling explanation. "I wanted to see what it feels like." This was how Sean described his motivation for ending Bauer's life. The clerk had done nothing to provoke the attack. Sean simply wanted to experience the act of taking another person from this world. Sean had become involved with Satanism and developed what he claimed was communication with a demon he called Ezerate. He also had an intense fixation on Dungeons and Dragons, though the connection between the game and his actions was disputed during legal proceedings. Defense attorneys attempted to portray him as delusional, but prosecutors argued his actions were calculated. The investigation into his parents' deaths initially treated Sean as a grieving victim. He had successfully staged the scene to suggest an intruder was responsible. However, his story began to unravel when acquaintances came forward with information. Sean's friend, Richard Howard, provided testimony that proved crucial to the case. Howard told investigators about Sean's involvement in Satanism and his prior statements about wanting to harm his parents. The staged crime scene was re-examined with new suspicion, and Sean was arrested. The trial connected Sean to both the Bauer murder and the deaths of his parents. Despite arguments about his mental state and the influence of his beliefs, the jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection on February 4, 1999. He was the first person executed in the United States for crimes committed at 16 since the reinstatement of capital punishment. His case became part of ongoing debates about juvenile sentencing. In the years between his conviction and execution, Sean claimed to have converted to Christianity and renounced his previous beliefs. He expressed remorse for his actions and wrote about his experiences from death row. Whether his transformation was genuine remained a point of debate among those who followed his case. Sean's execution drew attention from opponents of the death penalty. who argued that executing someone for crimes committed at 16 was cruel, regardless of the circumstances. The case became part of the national conversation about juvenile justice that continues today. Robert Bauer's family, Vonda's family, and Paul Bellafato's family all had to live with the knowledge that Sean's curiosity about taking life had cost them their loved ones. 3 people died so that a teenager could satisfy a dark impulse he later claimed came from demonic influence. The next case would involve a young man whose internal struggles exploded into tragedy. Kip Kinkle. On May 20th, 1998, in Springfield, Oregon, Kip Kinkle shot and killed his parents, Bill and Faith, in their family home. Bill had been a teacher, and Faith was a retired Spanish teacher who had devoted her career to education. The following day, Kip went to Thurston High School and opened fire, taking the lives of 2 students and wounding 25 others before being subdued by his classmates. Kip had been struggling with what would later be identified as schizophrenia. He heard voices that commanded him to commit acts of harm. The condition had gone undiagnosed throughout his adolescence, leaving him without the treatment that might have changed the trajectory of his life. The day before the school incident, Kip had been expelled for bringing a firearm onto campus. His father, Bill, picked him up from the police station after the arrest. The expulsion represented a crisis point that Kip could not process. That evening, he turned a rifle on both his parents. Bill Kinkle was shot first. Faith came home later and met the same fate. Kip then spent the night alone in the house with his parents' bodies, the voices in his head continuing their commands. By morning, he had decided to go to his school and continue what he had started. The scene at Thurston High School was chaotic. Kip entered the cafeteria and began firing. Students scattered, some trying to escape while others were struck by gunfire. 2 students, Ben Walker and Mikael Nicolason, lost their lives. 25 others were wounded before Kip was tackled and restrained by students. Kip later described his mental state in stark terms. "The voices made me do it." His confession detailed the commands he had been hearing and his inability to resist them. Psychiatric evaluation confirmed the presence of serious mental illness that had shaped his actions. Despite the mental health evidence, the legal proceedings resulted in a severe sentence. Kip pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge acknowledged his mental illness, but emphasized the catastrophic consequences of his actions. In recent years, Kip has spoken publicly about his case for the first time, expressing what he describes as tremendous shame and guilt. His sister Kristen has become an advocate for his release, arguing that decades of treatment have transformed him and that continued incarceration serves no purpose. Petitions for sentence review continue as of 2025. Kip Kinkle remains incarcerated in Oregon, having spent more than half his life behind bars for what he did when the voices in his head became too loud to ignore. The Kinkle case became a reference point for discussions about mental health and early intervention. Had Kip's schizophrenia been diagnosed and treated, the trajectory of multiple lives might have been different. Bill and Faith Kinkle might still be alive. Ben Walker and Mikael Nicolason might have grown into adulthood. The 25 students who were wounded that day carry physical and psychological scars from the attack. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences and their views on whether Kip deserves the possibility of release. Opinions within the survivor community remain divided. Kristen Kinkle has worked to humanize her brother while acknowledging the gravity of what he did. She argues that the teenage boy who committed those acts no longer exists, replaced by a medicated, remorseful man who poses no danger. The legal system continues to weigh these arguments against the lives that were lost. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would inspire books, films, and decades of debate about what really happened inside a house in Amityville. Ronald DeFeo Jr. On November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked into Henry's Bar in Amityville, New York, and announced that something terrible had happened to his family. He told the patrons that his parents had been shot. What he did not mention was that he already knew exactly what had occurred inside the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, because he was the one responsible. Police arrived at the DeFeo residence to discover 6 bodies. Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43 years old, and his wife Louise, 42, lay dead in their bed. Their children Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John had all been shot as well. The victims ranged from 9 to 18 years old. All had been shot with a rifle while they slept. Ronald Jr. was 23 years old at the time. He initially told police that the killings had been carried out by a mob hitman, claiming his father had connections to organized crime. But the story quickly fell apart under questioning. Within 24 hours, Ronald confessed to shooting all 6 members of his family. The motive behind the killings has never been definitively established. Ronald offered various explanations over the years, including claims that he heard voices commanding him to act. He also blamed substance use and described a volatile relationship with his father. Some investigators suspected financial motives related to insurance and inheritance. But Ronald's own statements remained inconsistent throughout his life. Forensic examination of the scene raised questions that have persisted for decades. All 6 victims were found in similar positions, face down in their beds, with no signs of a struggle. No neighbors reported hearing the gunshots, despite the rifle not being equipped with a silencer. How one person could have moved through the house and shot 6 people without any of them fleeing or fighting back has never been satisfactorily explained. The trial took place in 1975. Ronald's defense attempted to establish an insanity plea, arguing that he had been driven to the killings by psychological disturbance. The prosecution countered that the methodical nature of the killings demonstrated premeditation and awareness of his actions. The jury rejected the insanity defense. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life. The sentence effectively guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life in prison. When asked about his state of mind during the killings, Ronald reportedly stated, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop." The statement offered little clarity about what drove him to end the lives of his entire immediate family in a single night. The DeFeo house became famous as the setting for The Amityville Horror, a book and subsequent film franchise based on claims by later occupants that the property was haunted. The sensationalized stories overshadowed the real tragedy. 6 people who lost their lives at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect them. Ronald DeFeo Jr. died in prison on March 12, 2021. He was 69 years old and had spent 46 years incarcerated. He never provided a consistent explanation for why he did what he did that night in November 1974. Throughout his imprisonment, Ronald changed his story multiple times. At various points, he blamed mob hitmen, claimed his sister Dawn had participated in the killings, and asserted that supernatural forces had influenced him. None of these accounts were supported by evidence, and each new version seemed designed to shift blame away from himself. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue became a landmark of American true crime, its address recognized by millions who never knew the names of the people who died there. Ronald DeFeo Sr., Louise DeFeo, Dawn DeFeo, Allison DeFeo, Mark DeFeo, and John DeFeo. 6 people whose lives ended because one family member decided they should. The next case would involve a family destroyed on a farm in Essex, with questions about the true perpetrator still being raised today. Jeremy Bamber. On August 7, 1985, police received a call about a disturbance at White House Farm in Tullis Hunt, Darcy, Essex. The caller was Jeremy Bamber, the 24-year-old adopted son of the family who lived there. He told officers that his father Neville had phoned him in a panic, saying that his sister Sheila had gone berserk with a rifle before the line went dead. When police entered the farmhouse, they discovered 5 bodies. Neville Bamber, 61, and his wife June, 61, had both been shot. Their adopted daughter, Sheila Caffell, 28, was also dead, along with her twin sons Daniel and Nicholas. The victims had sustained a combined total of 25 gunshot wounds, most at close range. Initially, the scene appeared to support Jeremy's account. Sheila was found with the rifle across her body, having sustained 2 shots that appeared self-inflicted. She had a documented history of schizophrenia, and investigators initially concluded she had harmed her family during a psychotic episode before taking her own life. However, doubts emerged within weeks. A silencer was discovered in a cupboard at the farmhouse, and blood traces on it matched Sheila's. The physical implications were significant. With the silencer attached, the rifle would have been too long for Sheila to have shot herself in the manner the scene suggested. Jeremy's ex-girlfriend, Julie Mugford, came forward with damaging testimony. She told investigators that Jeremy had confided plans to harm his family in order to secure his inheritance. According to Mugford, Jeremy had expressed resentment toward his parents and indicated that they had nothing to live for. The potential inheritance was estimated at £436,000. The trial in 1986 resulted in a conviction by a majority verdict of 10-2. Jeremy was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be eligible for release. The verdict came after weeks of testimony that painted Jeremy as a calculating individual who had orchestrated the deaths of his entire family for financial gain. The sentencing judge described Jeremy as warped and evil beyond belief. The characterization reflected the court's view that Jeremy had methodically planned and executed the killings to secure financial gain, then attempted to frame his mentally ill sister for the crimes. The judge emphasized the calculated nature of the deception, noting that Jeremy had waited outside the farmhouse with police while his family lay dead inside. Jeremy has maintained his innocence for nearly 4 decades. His legal team has pursued multiple appeals, arguing that police mishandled evidence and that the silencer was planted. In October 2025, a podcast revealed evidence of a 911 call from inside the farmhouse that Jeremy's supporters claim provides him with an alibi, as he was documented outside with police at that time. Despite this new evidence, the Criminal Cases Review Commission has refused to refer the case back to the Court of Appeal. Jeremy Bamber remains incarcerated in a UK prison, continuing to proclaim his innocence while serving a sentence that will only end with his death. The White House Farm case remains one of the most debated in British criminal history. If Jeremy is guilty, he orchestrated the deaths of 5 family members and successfully framed his sister for nearly 2 weeks before investigators realized the truth. If he is innocent, he has spent 4 decades in prison for crimes committed by someone else. The truth, whatever it may be, lies buried with the 5 people who died that night in Essex. The next case involved a son who tried one method and, when it failed, tried another. Stephen Seddon. In March 2012, Stephen Seddon drove his elderly parents to the Bridgewater Canal near Manchester. Robert Seddon was 68 years old, a man who had trusted his son enough to get in the car with him. Patricia Seddon was 65. Stephen told them they were going for a drive together as a family outing. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Stephen deliberately drove the car into the canal with his parents strapped into the back seat. His plan was for them to drown while he escaped, making their deaths appear accidental. But the plan failed. All three were rescued from the water. Robert and Patricia survived, apparently unaware that their son had just attempted to end their lives. Stephen was 46 years old at the time and had accumulated significant debts through fraudulent schemes. His parents' estate was valued at approximately £230,000, and Stephen saw their deaths as the solution to his financial problems. When the canal attempt failed, he began planning an alternative approach. On July 4, 2012, Stephen went to his parents' home in Sale with a sawn-off shotgun. He shot both Robert and Patricia to death in their own house. This time, there would be no rescue, no survival. Stephen's financial pressures had driven him to execute his own mother and father. The investigation uncovered the connection between the canal incident and the shootings. CCTV footage and inconsistencies in Stephen's statements led detectives to suspect him. The attempted drowning, initially dismissed as an accident, was re-examined as the first murder attempt. The pattern became clear. Stephen had been trying to collect his inheritance through any means necessary. Stephen was convicted of 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The attempted murder charges related to the canal incident, which prosecutors successfully argued was a deliberate attempt to drown his parents. The sentencing judge imposed a whole life order with a minimum term of 40 years, telling Stephen, "You executed your own parents." The judge emphasized the calculated nature of the crimes. When one method failed, Stephen simply waited a few months and tried again with more direct means. Stephen Seddon remains incarcerated in a UK prison with no prospect of release. His parents, who had worked their entire lives to build the estate he coveted, died at the hands of the son they had raised and trusted. The inheritance Stephen sought to claim through their deaths was denied to him by his conviction. Robert and Patricia Seddon survived a deliberate attempt on their lives in March, never realizing their son had been the one who drove them into the canal. They had no warning when he returned 4 months later with a more direct approach. The trust they placed in their son made them vulnerable to a predator living in their own family. What would drive a man to stage a burglary to cover up what he had done to his own parents? Martin Ruddy. On December 12, 2014, in Ellswick, Newcastle, Martin Ruddy attacked his father, Eric, and stepmother, Carol, in their family home. Eric Ruddy was 64 years old, a man who had worked hard throughout his life to provide for his family. Carol Ruddy was 54, a woman who had become part of the family through her marriage to Eric. Neither survived what their son did to them that night in their own home. Martin used a brick to attack his father, striking him repeatedly. He then strangled his stepmother, Carol, with a television cable. The attacks were brutal and prolonged, leaving both victims dead in their own home. But Martin was not finished. He still needed to explain what had happened. Martin, who was 29 years old and had worked as a bouncer, staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. He inflicted injuries on himself to make it appear that he too had been a victim of the fictional intruders. He then called police to report that his parents had been attacked during a break-in. The motive was financial. Martin had accumulated debts and stood to inherit approximately £90,000 from his father's estate. Rather than address his financial problems through legitimate means, he decided that his parents' deaths would provide the solution he needed. The staged burglary quickly fell apart under investigation. CCTV footage from the area showed no evidence of intruders entering or leaving the property. DNA analysis found nothing to support the presence of unknown attackers. The forensic evidence pointed in only one direction, toward Martin himself. Investigators determined that the crime scene had been deliberately manipulated. The injuries Martin had inflicted on himself were inconsistent with an actual assault. The wounds on his parents told a different story than the one he had constructed. The evidence contradicted every element of his burglary narrative. Martin was convicted of 2 counts of murder at trial. The jury heard evidence of his debts, his inheritance motive, and the forensic findings that demolished his cover story. His attempt to deceive investigators had failed completely. The judge sentenced Martin to 2 life terms with a minimum of 35 years, describing his actions as a gross breach of trust. Eric and Carol had welcomed Martin into their home, never imagining that their son would repay their trust with betrayal. Martin Ruddy remains in a UK prison serving his sentence. The inheritance he sought to claim through his parents' deaths was denied to him by his conviction. Eric and Carol Ruddy, who deserved to live out their remaining years in peace, instead met their end at the hands of their own child. The staged burglary represented an additional layer of calculation beyond the killings themselves. Martin had not only decided to end his parents' lives, but had thought ahead to how he would explain the deaths. He prepared a cover story, inflicted wounds on himself, and called police with a false account of what had happened. The deception required planning that continued even after the attacks were complete. The next case would involve a weapon so brutal that the presiding judge could barely look at the crime scene photographs. Christopher Puglia. On May 16, 2020, in Joyner, a suburb of Brisbane, Australia, Christopher Puglia attacked his parents Franco and Loris in their family home. Both parents were 59 years old, a couple who had spent decades building their lives together and raising their children. The weapon Christopher chose was a sledgehammer, and the results were devastating beyond description. Christopher bludgeoned both his mother and father to death. The attack was prolonged and brutal, leaving Franco and Loris with catastrophic injuries. When it was over, Christopher fled the scene, leaving his parents' bodies in the home they had shared as a family. Christopher was 31 years old at the time and had been living with his parents after losing his job. The exact motive for the killings has never been clearly established. Investigators found evidence of family tensions following Christopher's return to the household, but nothing that adequately explained the ferocity of his actions. After the attack, Christopher drove south, eventually reaching New South Wales. He was arrested south of Newcastle, having fled hundreds of kilometers from the crime scene. His flight from Queensland demonstrated awareness that what he had done would bring severe consequences. The crime scene photographs were so graphic that the presiding judge expressed physical discomfort when viewing them. The pools of blood and the extent of the injuries inflicted on Franco and Loris Puglia illustrated the sustained nature of the attack. A sledgehammer wielded with force against human bodies produces results that even experienced legal professionals struggle to process. Christopher pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, sparing his family the ordeal of a trial, but offering no explanation for why he had done what he did. He was sentenced in March 2024 to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. Christopher's brother James addressed the court during sentencing, delivering a statement that captured the family's devastation. "You have lost the right to call them your parents." The words reflected the betrayal that James and other family members felt. Christopher had destroyed not just Franco and Loris, but the entire family structure. Christopher Puglia remains in an Australian prison, where he will spend at least the next 3 decades. Franco and Loris Puglia, who had taken their son back into their home during a difficult period, paid with their lives for that act of parental support. The case drew attention not just for its brutality, but for the choice of weapon. A sledgehammer is not a tool designed for harm. It is an implement found in garages and sheds, something Franco and Loris likely owned for household projects. Christopher turned an ordinary object into an instrument of destruction, using it against the people who had given him shelter when he needed it most. James Puglia lost both parents and his brother in a single day. Christopher may still be alive, but the brother James knew is gone, replaced by someone who could do what Christopher did in that house in Joyner. The final case would involve a man who had planned to continue his rampage but was stopped by mechanical failure. Corey Breen. On March 19, 2013, in Killarney Vale, New South Wales, Corey Breen attacked his father Paul and stepmother Felicia Crawford in their home. Paul was 54 years old, a man whose relationship with his son had been troubled for years. Felicia was 43. Corey had been carrying resentment toward them for years, and on that day, he decided to act on the fantasies that had been building inside him. Corey stabbed both Paul and Felicia multiple times. The attacks were deliberate and thorough, ensuring that neither would survive. When it was over, Corey left the house with blood on his hands and a plan to continue what he had started. Corey had intended to travel to his mother's residence and harm her as well, along with other family members. His plans extended beyond Paul and Felicia. He had a list of people he wanted to target. But his car broke down before he could reach his next destination, ending his rampage prematurely. Corey was 29 years old at the time. He had experienced a troubled childhood that included mistreatment from his father and stepmother. The resentment had built over years, evolving from anger into violent fantasies and finally into action. Corey later described himself as having been a time bomb waiting to explode. After his car failed, Corey went to police and confessed to what he had done. He walked investigators through the crime scene, describing his actions and his motivations in detail. He showed no apparent remorse, treating the confession as a matter-of-fact recounting of events. Corey described his state of mind in stark terms. The monster finally reached the surface. He spoke of violent fantasies he had harbored for years and his sense that committing the acts had been inevitable. The time bomb metaphor captured his view of himself as someone who had always been heading toward this outcome. Corey was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to 42 years in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. The sentence reflected both the brutality of his crimes and the evidence that he had planned to continue harming others. The judge noted that only the breakdown of his vehicle had prevented additional casualties. In November 2025, Corey appealed his sentence, seeking a reduction. The appeal argued that his difficult upbringing should have been given greater weight in determining his punishment. Prosecutors countered that his calculated actions and plans for additional victims warranted the original sentence. As of the latest reports, Corey remains in a New South Wales prison while the appeal proceeds through the courts. Corey Breen's stepbrother Dane witnessed part of the attack and has had to live with those memories ever since. The rampage that Corey planned was stopped by a broken-down car, but the damage he managed to inflict destroyed his family and left survivors carrying trauma that will never fully heal. Mechanical failure that ended Corey's plans may have saved multiple lives. His mother and other family members were on his list. People who might have been harmed if his vehicle had continued running. A faulty engine became the only barrier between Corey and additional victims. Paul Breen and Felicia Crawford were the ones who paid the price for whatever had built up inside Corey over the years. Whether the resentment he described was justified or distorted by his own perceptions, the outcome was the same. 2 people dead and a family shattered by someone who was supposed to be part of it. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.